here. I don't know if I'd pick like working on my anniversary, but it was worth it.
So I knew you were going to say that.
And they have great food here. So this feels pretty perfect to me, that this is the way we're closing this week. That it was just... Gwen's book, I think, raises some questions of this ilk. Are we in an era of post-racial politics? How will African-American political influence be empowered or weakened? Will this new generation of African-American gifted politicians be held to a higher bar? Will they disappoint blacks? Will they disappoint whites? And what happens to the black agenda during this time? And all of these important questions, Gwen Ifill explores using all her very considerable skills to analyze and begin to phrase and frame the answers to these questions. For those of you that might not know, Gwen worked at the Boston Herald, the Baltimore Evening Sun, the Washington Post, New York Times, and NBC. In October of 1999, she made all of us very happy by becoming the moderator of PBS's Washington Week in Review. And senior correspondent for the NewsHour with Jim Lear. She also, as you know, brilliantly moderated the vice presidential. Here's what Gwen and I were talking about. I was saying, like, I don't know whether she's Queen Latifah or Queen Latifah. But so I'm going to go. And so now I do have to say, I think of you as kind of Queen Latifah.
Yeah.
But here's what's interesting about the timing of things. Queen Latifah also impersonated Gwen after the 2004 debate, but I bet most of us, including myself, don't remember that. So it's all about...
Tina Fey.
Right. So for many of us who are her devoted fans, her wisdom and professionalism and sharp journalistic skills are the breakthrough, I think, for the way that paved the way for the big breakthrough that we all have experienced. And it's because of professionals like Gwen, who were there doing what they were doing with the hard work and the professionalism that began to make the beginning of race really not being about the issue. It's all about being great at what you do and being able to effectuate the kind of hope and change. And I think having, you know, the idea that we might have a president leading us out of the wilderness is pretty exciting. Having journalists like Gwen Ifill to lead us through the story of leading us out of the wilderness, pretty perfect. So please join me in welcoming Gwen Ifill.
I'm going to sit for a minute, and then when we take your questions, I'm going to stand and do the Oprah thing, because some of you may know that just before the vice presidential debate, I slipped at home and broke my ankle. I know, 4 months ago, and I'm still a little bit uncertain on my legs. But I'm going to sit here and chit-chat with you a little bit about the book and how it came to be, and then I really look forward to your questions, because that's where I get to learn things. One of the interesting things about the little kerfluffle, I call it, prior to the debate about this book, is that they had it exactly wrong. And they knew it and didn't care. They thought I was writing a pro-Obama puff book. And in fact, I was writing a book that had been loitering in my head since my very first journalism job, and even though I didn't realize it at the time. When I was approached to write a book by the publisher, they actually wanted me to write an Obama book, and I said, oh no, that's going to be done. And I didn't want to, someone had warned me, don't do a book unless, this is my first book. No, someone warned me, don't write a book unless you want to live it in your head, to haunt you in your dreams. It can't be a subject. There's a lot of things I don't want to live with at night. It's got to be a subject that you're carrying around in your head. And I was carrying around the cumulative effect of all these bits and pieces of things I'd covered. My first job at the Herald American in Boston, my very first job was writing about food because it was the only writing job open. So even though I couldn't cook, I wrote about food because, hey, you can teach yourself anything, right? And I can cook now. But I wrote also about the school busing crisis in the 70s in Boston. And I watched what happened when people were really fighting over one little piece of power. They were fighting over a little bit of control about their kids' lives, about their kids' futures, and it was all about politics. And politics drove that. And I put it away in a corner of my brain. That was interesting. That was about politics. Maybe I like politics. I moved to Baltimore, and I started covering City Hall there at a time when the city was going kind of tipping point from 50-50, white to black. And the first black mayor was appointed while I was there, and I watched that because power was changing hands. And there was some inherent struggle and friction that comes with that. You know, power concedes nothing without a demand. This is what was happening along the way. Same thing happened when I moved to the Washington Post to cover suburban Washington, where the same kind of tipping point was happening. So I began to detect a trend. And when I covered my first presidential campaign for the Post, I was the low person on the totem pole, which means that, you know, I covered the least likely guy to win. So they always put me on the candidate who's about to drop out. So I covered Dick Gephardt and Bob Dole and Paul Simon. And, you know, that all lasts for about a week. And I arrived, they could probably looked at me as the angel of doom. But the last candidate standing besides Michael Dukakis in 1988, you'll recall, was Jesse Jackson. So I spent a lot of time watching. He refused to die. I spent a lot of time following him closely and watching the way that he ran what was essentially at the time a race-driven campaign in the beginning. And as he began to win, he won 13 contests that year, people forget. When he began to win, began to get crossover votes, he also began to moderate some of his race-based appeal, which was interesting to watch. But I filed that away as well. Jesse Jackson was a very interesting man to cover because if you were a white reporter, he had a way of making you feel racist, you know? If you asked him a hard question, and he'd look at you like, I should have known you would have asked me that. And the poor white reporters would go, oh my God, am I a racist? And then if you were a black reporter, of which there are a few of us, because once again, we were the ones who captured the last people standing, he would make you feel like you were a sellout. You asked him a hard question, he'd go, what would your mama think about that? So no matter how you worked it, he worked you. While you were sitting there going, I don't know, am I a sellout? He would be gone. But it was interesting. I covered him. I covered in '92 Bill Clinton from beginning to end. And Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton built up a strong root of support in the black community for a reason. They knew how to work it from being Southern politicians, and I was exposed to a different way of dealing with race politics. So along the way, I was kind of filing all of this away. When this year came around, and I was aware of Barack Obama's ambitions when I started this book, but I didn't think he was the whole story. And I was vindicated because everyone I talked to along the way for this book said, I'm so glad you're writing this because I've been thinking about this too. My first thought was kind of a simplistic one, which is, oh, okay, it's people with an Ivy League degree, they're 40 years old, and basically they're all Obama wannabes, all Obama lights, and I would just write a story about them. But the more I dug in, the more I realized that some of them were 60 years old. Some of them were 23 years old. And there was a generational shift that was as potent as the racial shift, if anything. I'll tell you, I'll read a little bit and talk a little bit, and then we'll take some questions. At the very opening of the book, I write, I learned how to cover race riots by telephone. They didn't pay me enough at my first newspaper job to venture onto the grounds of South Boston High School when bricks were being thrown. Instead, I would telephone the headmaster and ask him to relay to me the number of broken chairs in the cafeteria each day. A white colleague dispatched to the scene would fill in the details for me. I've spent 30 years in journalism since then, chronicling stories like that. Places where truth and consequences collide, rub up against each other, and shift history's course. None of that prepared me for 2008 and the astonishing rise of Barack Obama. It is true that he accomplished what no black man had before, but it went further than that. Simply as an exercise in efficient politics, Obama 08 rewrote the textbook. His accomplishment was historic and one that transformed how race and politics intersect in our society. Obama is the leading edge of this change, but his success is merely the ripple in a pond that grows deeper every day. When people do something that they've never done before, I think that makes it easier to do it a second time, said David Axelrod, the Obama campaign's chief strategist. He told me this just days after Obama won. So when people vote for an African-American candidate, I think it makes it easier for the next African-American candidate. The next African-American candidates, and a fair share of those already in office, subscribe to a formula driven as much by demographics as by destiny. When population shifts occur, brought about by fair housing laws, affirmative action, and landmark school desegregation rulings, political power is challenged as well. It happened in Boston, New York, Chicago, and every other big city reshaped by an influx of European migration. It is happening again now in Miami, in Los Angeles, in suburban Virginia, and rural North Carolina, where the political calculus is being reshaped by Latino immigrants. With African Americans freighted with the legacy of slavery and the pushback from whites who refuse to feel guilty for the sins of their ancestors, the shift has been more scattered and sporadic, but no less profound. So I sat there and thought to myself, who are these people? How do I find them? And I found them the way reporters find everything, which was asking somebody else to point you in the right direction. So I would talk to Obama, I knew, and I knew of Deval Patrick, and I knew of, I always forget, Cory Booker, the mayor of Newark. But I knew only a little bit more in common than I thought, and not just Ivy League degrees. What they had in common, including Artur Davis, the fourth person I focus on, who's a congressman from Alabama, who probably wants to be governor of Alabama next year. One of the things, which more in a moment, but one of the things they all had in common is that somebody early in their careers told them that they had to wait their turn. And in order to break through, they had to break past people of their own race who told them, you know what, I've had this job since I marched with Dr. King, so you need to just step back and let me finish. And they would go, no, I don't think so. And they would run, and sometimes they would lose the first time. But they ran against the entrenched black political establishment as much as against anybody white, which was the first hurdle. Barack Obama's first hurdle, as quietly as it's kept, was to win over black voters who were with Hillary Clinton all the way through Iowa, right until he won Iowa, at which point they said, oh, maybe he can do this. Let's see if we can make it work. So along the way, there's always friction. There's always, Julian Bond told the young 35-year-old head of the NAACP, when he was much younger and actually was participating in the March on Washington in 1993, the young people at that march felt that they had been shunted to the side and no one was paying attention to them. And Julian Bond said to them, you know, if you perceive that I hold a torch, that I have power, and you want it, it is your job to snatch it from me. So there's a whole lot of snatching going on. It's happening in city halls, it's happening in state houses, it's happening in district attorney's offices, and it's happening not in traditional liberal democratic politics. Almost all of these breakthrough politicians are finding ways to strike. It's easy to overlook change when it happens, even when it is dramatic and historic, as this year's breakthrough presidential election. But as I stood at Denver's Invesco Field on the night Barack Obama accepted his party's nomination for president, I swear I could feel the rumbling under my feet. Reverend Jesse Jackson strode through the crowd, remembering how different this night was from the day 24 years ago when he'd had his own star turn at a Democratic National Convention. Cory Booker, the mayor of Newark, New Jersey, and Deval Patrick, the governor of Massachusetts, grinned and backslapped and owned the night as the rising stars they are. Artur Davis, the Alabama congressman with designs on the governor's office, sorted through a crowded dance card of public appearances. Benjamin Jealous, newly elected to lead the venerable NAACP, choked up. He was 35 years old. Each in his own way was basking in the political glow of the night. They were not interlopers or token black invitees at this particular party. They did not necessarily even know each other particularly well, but they were the stars of the evening. For one night, all of the friction and below-the-radar political positioning each had endured, much of it obscured by Obama's rise, was on display. It was a rare lightning stroke moment that finally illuminated the dramatic shift in tone, message, and leadership that has forced a redefinition of black politics and of black politicians. It was the age of Obama in full effect. This is one of those moments where it was helpful for me to be working two jobs and trying to write a book at the same time. Because as I stood at the NewsHour platform that night, I was able to look through the crowd and pick all of these things out. And as I was pondering this, I ran into George Stephanopoulos from ABC, who knew I was working on this book, and the first thing he said to me was, "This is the first page of your book, right?" Now, it's not the first page, so he was wrong. But it did help to have someone say, look at this through that. This is the moment when all of this comes together. And it was kind of a remarkable moment. That was the breakthrough night. Now, the stress and the friction that I talk about within the Black community is a recurring theme throughout the book. Whether it involves fathers and sons, mothers and sons, whether it involves, Carrie Meek, a former congresswoman from Miami, told me she really, really wanted to support Barack Obama. She said, I could feel the beating of the jungle drums and all that stuff. She wanted to do it, but her son, the current congressman, Kendrick Meek, was sticking with Hillary Clinton to the bitter end, and she didn't want for her son to be embarrassed or for there to be a dispute about it. So she had the hardest time with it. A lot of younger members of Congress or younger legislators who support things like school vouchers, it was anathema to their parents. So there is that kind of friction. One of the interesting things, too, is that people who have run the traditional civil rights organizations who have failed to step aside, perhaps in the most timely fashion. One of the people I talked to about all of this along the way was Vernon Jordan, the super lawyer in Washington now, also ran for years in National Urban League. He earned his civil rights bona fides running the Urban League and the United Negro College Fund, but he learned the ropes of the movement, chauffeuring NAACP pioneer Roy Wilkins to and from meetings in Georgia in the 1960s. He identifies 5 distinct brands of Black leadership: the grassroots activist, the corporate titan, the traditional civil rights organizer, the self-made entrepreneur, and the elected official. These leaders range from CEOs to hip-hop artists to mayors, and they do not necessarily represent a single world view. There's a tough question. Do all African Americans even want the same things? It's lazy and simple to lump them all together as a group that harbors the same grievances and aspirations. In fact, as a 2007 NPR Pew Research poll of more than 1,000 African Americans showed, African Americans are no monolith. 61% said they saw more differences than similarities between the values of middle class and poor blacks. The same report also found that more than 1/3 of African Americans believe that blacks are too diverse to be thought of as a single race. And the report concluded that the gulf existed between middle class and poor blacks. Interestingly enough, it was not a case of the bourgeoisie looking down its nose at the underclass. The survey showed that poorer blacks were the ones more likely to see the existence of a gap between the poor and the middle class and what has come to be branded family values, before somebody hijacked the term family values. So that was interesting to me. It was interesting to me that there was turmoil, that there was discussion, that there was unreported debate going on in the Black community that most people, most onlookers, black, white, green, wouldn't necessarily notice. And then became this other question, which I touched on in the book, and which I'll use as my last example of kind of what I found interesting in my 2-year odyssey of trying to get this book written. And that's the whole question of race identity. You know, nobody ever, the only people who ever ask somebody if they're black enough are other black people. It is a kind of an absurd question. What does it mean to be black enough? People kept bringing it up to me. It was a common theme. Even Ed Brooke, the venerable patrician former senator from Massachusetts, said to me, people ask me that all the time, and I didn't know what they meant. He knew what they meant, but I didn't know what they meant. And I asked around and asked around until finally someone came up with a good definition for me of what it really was about. It wasn't about, are you black enough? It was about, are you down with the cause? Are you on my side? Will you represent me or will you sell me out? And once that question was settled, blacks were more satisfied. But then there was the flip side of this, which is the, are you too black? Are you Bill Cosby black, or are you, I don't know, Wesley Snipes black? I don't know. Are you gonna scare me? You're gonna make me feel guilty? Am I gonna feel blame if I listen to you? That is the kind of tightrope that Barack Obama had to walk. On the night Barack Obama won the South Carolina primary, his supporters could barely contain themselves. Bouncing back from a surprise defeat 2 weeks before in New Hampshire, the double-digit victory thrilled the multiracial crowd gathered that night in the heart of the South. When their candidate appeared, they took up a chant. Race doesn't matter. Race doesn't matter. They shouted in unison, and it spilt and it spread throughout the room. Standing at the foot of the stage in a ballroom just blocks from the state capitol, Obama's pollster, Cornell Belcher, who was black, watched in astonishment. Here you are in South Carolina, 3 blocks from where the Confederate flag is still flying, in front of the state capitol, and all the history that's held in that state. And you have a group of young people, young white people, shouting, race doesn't matter? Now, do they think there is no racism? No. But were they screaming and shouting the world they wanted to exist? Yeah. That is powerful and profound and very different, he said. This may have been the only night during the course of the campaign where anyone believed that race did not matter. Certainly the candidate at the center of all the euphoria did not believe it. Obama, like every other elected official in the United States, was keenly aware of how much the nation's mood swings on race could determine the outcome of a competitive election. Sometimes race helped, sometimes it hurt, but it always mattered. On that note, I'm going to stop because I feel like I've been chatting for a while, and I would really like to hear what you all have to ask me and say, because every time I've done this since in the week the book's been out, not even a week, I've had the most interesting learning experience from the people I'm talking to. So I'd love to take your questions now.
Others who went the route of a better chance?
I didn't find any others. He was the most notable example. It's possible that a lot of people who went through a better chance ended up in other leadership roles, but not in politics, which is what's also happened, by the way, with women. A lot of women go into leadership roles, but not necessarily elective office.
Part of the characteristic is the educational background.
I think that's a completely fair point, that's the common, once you have access, a lot of these folks
talk about African Americans as if we were kind of this one singular group, and of course they would be supporting Obama. And how did you, as an African American woman,
long time. And it's become second nature to me not to particularly be moved by personal bias. I'll get back to the second question. It's an interesting one. The first question is interesting because it was actually simpler. First of all, you got to stop listening to all those pundits. They make you crazy. They make you crazy. Listen to people who help you know what you want to think and don't tell you what you want to think. That's my little PBS plug. People, when it comes to race, are pretty lazy in deciding. They're lazy about a lot of things, but they're really lazy with race. And the reason they're lazy is because they're uncomfortable talking about race. It's the kind of thing that they think they're talking about conflict if they talk about race. They're not used to talking about race as a positive. So someone wrote me a letter last week, an email saying, why can't we just forget that Barack Obama's black? And I said, really? Why would we want to do that? Examine the reason for that question. Why? Unless you think it's a bad thing, at which point, of course, they fell silent, because that's what happened. We're used to talking about race only in the context of conflict. And when we do that, we reach for lazy descriptions of what it is people believe and how they don't believe it. And the facts will always out. And the facts were that black voters did not support him in overwhelming numbers until they made the key decision that he could win. That's the way a lot of people made these decisions. It wasn't race pride that drove him to it. It was, well, can he win? Okay, well, in that case. The second question, which was interesting, my bias, or lack thereof. I have to tell you, I'm capable of holding 2 thoughts in my head at one time. And that's what, I worked for bosses who have told me that they don't believe the reporters should vote in an election. Not one of these bosses ever had their ancestors hosed for the right to vote. So my feeling is you just can't really tell me what to do. I am capable of writing a story and asking you questions and keeping my ears open to hear. It's one of the reasons I don't like punditry or expressing opinion, because I think once you've made up your mind what you think, you stop listening for the possibility of another point of view. And that's what we have a lot of right now on cable television and whatever, telling you ought to believe this. I have to say, however, on election night at 11 o'clock, I was sitting on the set in Washington with 2 of our political analysts, and we were reading exit polls and numbers crunching and trying to decide. And I heard Jim Lehrer say, and Barack Obama is the 44th president of the United States. And I had to stop for a minute. And I kind of did this, and they said, what are you doing? Are you okay? And I said, I'm having a black moment here. And then I stopped, a few seconds, and then I said, okay, back to work. And we went back. You know, for my parents, I had to acknowledge that moment, you know? And then I moved on. And they would be proud of that, too. Yes.
Feeding off on the preceding question about the non-homogeneity of African Americans as they are defined today, Obama's father was Kenyan, you're of Bayesian descent, and I'm wondering if this is the next. I went to Barbados, so I looked up there. And I'm wondering if this is the next hurdle in black politics in America. Do you comment on that in your book? And Also, sort of related, have you ever thought about going into politics yourself?
No, but it's much easier to ask the questions than answer them, as I'm discovering tonight. But the first question I didn't quite get. You're talking about whether the hurdle is immigration, people?
Well, yes, people of more recent or different African descent, so to speak, in America today.
You know, I don't know. I think that that's kind of a false choice right now, because I'm not sure that a whole lot of people are slicing that fine. There are a lot of black immigrants and some black Americans who are slicing that fine. Well, of course, you know, he's not really black because he's not the descendant of American slaves. What? You know, does that mean that I'm not really black because my slaves, my forebears harvested sugar cane instead of cotton? What kind of a false choice is that? So I don't think that's it, even though I should say that as a daughter of immigrants, anybody who's a child of immigrants knows that when you uproot your life and move someplace else in order to give your children a better life, they better damn well not fail. Exactly. And so there's a certain amount of extra oomph and push that's given. But Barack Obama is an odd example because he grew up with a peripatetic mother. He was raised by his grandparents in Hawaii. He didn't fit into anybody's idea of what typical America is, which is why it's even more remarkable that he was able to convince the majority of Americans that he was more like than unlike them. Yes. Yeah.
I've been thinking through this whole election cycle that it's transformational as it is to have elected Barack Obama to the White House. That it's at least as transformational, or possibly even more so, that we have a black first lady. And I've been talking to my students a lot about this and thinking about this because I think there are some things about Michelle Obama's being the first lady that haven't even really been addressed in the public. And
because we don't know how.
Right. Well, I'm interested to know if you have any thoughts about that.
I am very curious to see how this unfolds. I think that people were so caught up with the idea of electing Barack Obama that they woke up the next day and went, oh, she's kind of cool too. The interesting thing about her too is that she is so untraditionally accomplished lawyer and businesswoman. And how she's going to define that job is the next big tightrope. Remember what happened to Hillary Clinton when she arrived as big-time lawyer and she was going to help with policy? That didn't go so well. And then we got Laura Bush, who went back to the more traditional China pattern picking kind of line. Now we have, I like Laura Bush. but now we go back to Michelle, who's like nothing anyone has ever seen. They don't know what to expect. They don't know what she's like. They like her so far. I don't know how much room they'll give her to run. I think she's very aware of the kind of ringer she went through in the campaign, where she made one offhand comment and they jumped on her and said she was, you know, when she said, I've never been so proud of my country. If you listen to the whole statement, you know what the context was. But once again, they chose not to. They chose to demonize her. I remember there's a cover of National Review, the conservative magazine, with a picture of her doing like this, and it said, Mrs. Grievance. And so the storyline became that she was the one who carried all the grievances that he didn't have. And so that's something she's got to be aware of and trying to figure out how to negotiate, at the same time making sure her children stay normal. Yes?
I found an interesting point you raised, because I found in campaigning for President Obama that you began to learn the covers of racism, and you began to learn what was underneath their, their objections. That came out all the time.
Yeah.
All the time. It's a woman, she's African American, and they're not going to go after him, but they're going to go after her.
Yeah.
And that's, I heard, well, I don't like that his wife made this statement that she's never been, always, that was like the #1 objection when anybody said they were.
It really is. And she spent a lot of time in the campaign then trying to do what her husband was trying to do, which is, I am really like you. She spent a lot more time talking about what a mom she was, and, you know, and doing all these stories. It's what you do in politics. It's something that you'll remember the Clintons did belatedly. They got all the way to the convention in 1992 before anyone knew they had a kid. They were so busy protecting Chelsea that people didn't know. So then there was this very stagey picture in People magazine of the three of them in a hammock laughing together, trying to humanize them as parents, something they had neglected to do right up until that point. The Obamas learn from those mistakes, but then have other hurdles, which they've got to get over. Yes?
I wanted to, the term where those that are from the African American black community understand that even with all the great thing that Obama has done, that there's still a lot that's going on that's not going to change just because he's president. And then on the other hand, the other population, white population, whoever that decided to vote for him as well, it's has a connotation that let's be part of history as well as do the favor, and that erases everything.
Yeah.
So the terminology, where did it come from, or do you have any idea?
It bothers me too.
Okay.
I made a Maori. Early on. And after I reattached my head to my shoulders, I never embraced it again, because his point was a good one, which is to say something is post-racial is to suggest that we are past it now. Let's concentrate on something else. Henry Louis Gates wrote a lovely column the day after Barack Obama was elected that ran on the Root website, in which he talked about how Barack Obama's election did not erase the bloody stain of history. It's something Condoleezza Rice calls the national birth defect. It's still there. It's still there. It doesn't go away. There is an incentive to put it behind us and say, phew, don't have to worry about that anymore. But, you know, you just look at the numbers, and the numbers don't support that it's over. And Barack Obama would not tell you that his election, in one fell swoop, fixed everything. It doesn't mean that we have to be fighting about it every day, but it also means that we can't pretend that it doesn't exist. I'm suspicious of anyone who looks at me and says, you know, I'm just colorblind. Because I think, well, you must be blind, because not only am I black, but I don't have a problem with it. And if you're trying to erase it, pretend that it doesn't exist, you have a problem with it, and it's something that you need to deal with. And what we need to do is appreciate our differences without fighting about them all the time. I think we can do that. I think Barack Obama provides us an opening to start having those conversations, but we're nowhere near fixing it yet. Yes.
Of all the debates, I think the one that was people were most curious about was the vice presidential debate, largely